They returned to the camp as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. And Rin clicked his mandibles in disbelief when Velith showed him the container of water that Yuna had retrieved from inside the canyon stone. "This is impossible," Rin said as he examined the clear liquid with his compound eyes. The survey stated with 97% certainty that no extractable water existed anywhere on Keth 4. "The surveys were wrong," Velith said. And speaking those words aloud felt like breaking a sacred rule she had followed for her entire career. Or perhaps they were simply incomplete in ways none of us understood until now. Yuna did not participate in the debate because she was already kneeling beside Orison, helping him drink the water he so desperately needed. And the Kalori student made sounds of relief and gratitude as the moisture began to restore his cracking skin slowly. Yuna said with gentle authority, "Your body needs time to absorb it, and drinking too fast will only make you sick." Velith watched the human care for her alien classmate with a tenderness that seemed at odds with everything she had been taught about the violent species from the death world called Earth. And she found herself questioning assumptions she had held without examination for far too long. Could that be? Velith said when Oris had drunk his fill and his eyes had begun to regain their normal brightness. "I need to understand how you knew to look for water in such an unlikely place." Yuna settled back on her heels and wiped the dust from her face with a cloth that had once been part of her uniform before the crash had turned everything into survival equipment. "I did not know for certain," Yuna said, "but humans have been finding water in deserts for longer than we have had written language and the techniques my grandmother taught me have been tested by thousands of generations before I was born." She looked toward the canyon system where darkness was already gathering in the deep places between the stone walls. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of inherited memory. "Earth is a hard world," Yuna said. "Every environment wants to kill you, and water is never guaranteed, and our ancestors had to learn or die in every generation." Rin had stopped his repairs on the communications array and was listening with his full attention, his earlier mockery of human methods completely forgotten in the face of evidence. He could not deny the Meldari evolved on a world with abundant resources. Rin said with something like shame coloring his clicks and buzzes. "We never had to develop such techniques because water was always available and survival was never a question." "The Thesari as well," Velith admitted. "My species developed advanced technology early in our history because our world provided everything we needed to support civilization without significant struggle." Yuna nodded without judgment, because she understood that different species had faced different challenges and developed different strengths in response to their unique circumstances. "Humans had almost nothing," Yuna said. "Our world was dangerous and scarce and filled with creatures that wanted to eat us. And we survived by learning to adapt faster than anything else." She picked up a handful of the red desert sand and let it flow through her fingers as she continued her explanation. "We learned to read landscapes the way you read books," Yuna said. "The angle of a shadow tells us where caves might form, and the pattern of animal tracks tells us where water hides, and the color of stone tells us what minerals lie beneath." Velith felt something stir inside her that she had not experienced since her earliest days as a student. A hunger for knowledge that went beyond databases and surveys and officially sanctioned methods. "How did your grandmother learn these things?" Velith asked. "Was she a scientist or a survival specialist like myself?" Yuna laughed softly, and the sound was both sad and warm at the same time. "My grandmother was a farmer's daughter who lived through a terrible war," Yuna said. "When her village was destroyed, she walked across a desert with her younger siblings and kept them alive by finding water in places where soldiers with all their equipment had died of thirst." She paused and looked at Velith with eyes that held depths the instructor had never noticed before. "She taught my mother, and my mother taught me," Yuna continued. Not in a classroom, but in the fields, in the mountains, and the hard places where official knowledge means nothing, and only practical wisdom keeps you breathing. Aris spoke for the first time since beginning his recovery. His voice still weak, but filled with genuine curiosity. Do all humans learn such things from their families? He asked. Not all, Yuna admitted. Many humans have forgotten the old ways, because they no longer need them in our modern cities with our clean water and our comfortable lives. She smiled with something that looked like both pride and sorrow mixing together. But some families remember, she said. We pass down the knowledge, even when it seemed useless, because we know that the world can change in an instant, and the skills that saved our ancestors might save our children someday. Vela thought about her own training at the Galactic Academy. The decades of study and certification and approved methods that had prepared her to teach survival to species from across the galaxy. She had always believed that proper education came from institutions and experts, and carefully designed curricula, and she had never considered that some of the most valuable knowledge might live only in the memories of grandmothers who had walked through deserts with nothing but desperate determination. I've been an instructor for 40 years, Vela said slowly, and I have taught survival techniques from over 200 worlds to thousands of students who trusted me to prepare them for anything. She looked at Yuna with new eyes and continued speaking words that felt like a confession. But I never learned to look for water in the way you describe, Vela said. I never learned to read landscapes with my eyes instead of my instruments, and I never understood that the most primitive techniques might also be the most reliable. Yuna stood and walked to where Vela sat, and she placed a hand on the instructor's scaled shoulder with a gentleness that surprised them both. You know things I will never learn, Yuna said. Your technology and your databases and your surveys have mapped the galaxy in ways my ancestors could never imagine. She squeezed the shoulder slightly before letting her hand fall. But knowledge flows in many directions, Yuna continued. And the greatest wisdom comes from understanding that everyone has something to teach if you are willing to learn. The night fell around them as they sat together in the shelter of the ruined shuttle. And Valeth found herself asking questions she had never thought to ask before. She learned about Earth's deserts and forests and frozen wastelands and the humans who had survived in all of them. And she learned about techniques passed down through bloodlines that stretched back before recorded history. By dawn, Valeth had begun to understand something that would change her teaching forever. The galaxy was full of knowledge that no academy had ever cataloged. Living wisdom that existed only in the memories of those who had faced death and found ways to live. And she had almost lost all of them because she had trusted surveys instead of students. The rescue shuttle descended through the pink sky of Keth 4 on the morning of the 6th day, and Valeth watched it approach with emotions she could not easily name swirling through her mind. They had survived against every calculation and every survey and every prediction she had made in those terrible first hours after the crash. All four of them had lived to see the rescue lights cutting through the dawn. Oris stood on his own strength now, with his skin restored to its normal healthy sheen thanks to the water they had collected from the condensation cave and the dozen solar stills that dotted the ground around their camper had even managed to partially repair the communications array on the 5th day, boosting their signal enough to guide the rescue team directly to their location without additional searching. But it was Yuna who drew the eyes of the rescue crew as they emerged from their shuttle and surveyed the scene with expressions of pure disbelief. This is not possible, said the rescue commander, a Vrelian with silver fur and wide golden eyes. No one survives a Class 7 desert without water recycling technology for 6 standard days. Valeth stepped forward to make her report. But before she could speak, the commander noticed the solar stills arranged across the ground and the containers of water stored in the shuttle shade. "What are those devices?" the commander asked. "I do not recognize the technology." "They are not technology," Vela said, and she heard the wonder in her own voice as she spoke. "They are something far older and far more valuable." She told the story of their survival from the beginning, leaving out nothing and crediting Yuna at every turn for the knowledge and courage that had kept them alive when all logical analysis said they should have died. The rescue commander listened with growing amazement and made notes on a recording device. And when Valeth finished, the commander looked at Yuna with something approaching reverence. "You learned this from your grandmother?" the commander asked. "From her and from the generations before her." Yuna said, "Humans have walked through deserts since before we had words to describe what we were doing. And we learned to find water because the alternative was death." The rescue crew helped them board the shuttle and began the process of documenting everything for their official reports. And Valeth knew that this story would spread through the academy and beyond. Within days of their return, Ren sat beside Yuna during the flight home, and his earlier mockery had transformed into genuine admiration that he did not try to hide. "I was wrong about you," Rin said, with his mandibles clicking in the pattern that indicated shame among his species. "I thought humans were primitive because you lacked the technology that other species developed. But now I understand that you simply chose to remember what the rest of us forgot." Yuna accepted his apology with grace and spent the remainder of the flight teaching him about other survival techniques that humans had developed over their long history of struggling against an unforgiving world. Oris performed a ritual that Valith had only read about in cultural databases, a Kalori water blessing that his people reserved for those who had saved their lives through the gift of hydration. He spoke words in his native tongue and touched water to Yuna's forehead and declared her a water friend to his entire species, a bond that would follow her for the rest of her life. Yuna accepted the honor with tears in her eyes because she understood what it meant to be trusted by beings who could not survive without the element she had found in a world that supposedly held none. When the shuttle finally docked at the Academy station, a crowd had gathered to see the survivors of what everyone was already calling the Kethform. Maracle Valeth walked through the crowd with her students behind her, and she did not stop until she reached the office of the Academy director, where she requested an immediate meeting to discuss changes to the survival curriculum. The director listened to her proposal with skepticism at first, but Valeth had brought evidence that could not be denied. She showed recordings of the solar stills producing water from nothing, and she showed samples from the condensation cave that no survey had ever detected. And she showed the testimony of 4 survivors who should have died but lived because one human remembered what her grandmother had taught her. "You want to add a new course to the Academy curriculum," the director said slowly. "A course on ancestral survival techniques from pre-technological civilizations." "Yes," Valeth said. "Starting with humans but eventually expanding to include traditional knowledge from any species that developed survival methods before they gained access to galactic technology." The director considered this proposal for a long moment, and Valeth could see the conflict playing across his features as he weighed tradition against innovation. "The Academy has never taught unverified techniques," the director said. "Our methods are based on scientific surveys and tested technology and measurable results, and those methods would have killed us on Keth 4, Valeth said without flinching. "The surveys were incomplete because they only looked for what they expected to find. And our technology failed because machines break while knowledge survives." She leaned forward and spoke with conviction that came from 6 days of learning humility in a desert that should have been her grave. The galaxy is vast, and our surveys cover only a fraction of its possibilities, Valith said. But species like humans have been surviving on hostile worlds for thousands of generations without any technology at all. And their methods work in ways our instruments cannot measure. The director looked at Una, who had accompanied Valith to the meeting, and he asked her directly whether she believed such knowledge could be taught to species who had never experienced the desperate need that created it. Una thought carefully before answering. Survival? Knowledge is not just about techniques, she said. It is about learning to see the world with different eyes and to trust in possibilities that logic says cannot exist. She stood straighter and spoke with quiet pride in her voice. Humans learned to find water in deserts because giving up meant death. And we passed that knowledge to our children because we loved them enough to prepare them for the worst the universe might offer. She looked at the director with steady eyes. Any species can learn to see the way we see, Una said. They just need someone willing to teach them, and the humility to accept that the most valuable knowledge does not always come from the most advanced civilizations. The director was silent for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly and reached for the documents that would authorize the creation of a new course at the Galactic Academy. 3 months later, Valith stood before her. First class on ancestral survival techniques, and looked out at students from dozens of species who had come to learn what no database could teach them. And sitting in the front row with a smile on her face was Una Beak, ready to help her share the wisdom of grandmothers with a galaxy that had forgotten how to find water in the stone. First lesson began with a simple question. What do you see when you look at a desert? And the students learned to see everything. By the end of the second day, they had constructed 12 solar stills, arranged in a careful pattern across the ground near the crashed shuttle. And each one produced a small trickle of water that together provided barely enough to keep them alive while with watched Una work without rest, and she found herself unable to maintain the skepticism that had defined her view of humans since they first appeared at the Galactic Academy 3 years ago. The human moved with purpose and efficiency, and something else that Valith slowly recognized as experience, not the kind learned from books or simulations, but the kind burned into muscle and bone through generations of survival against impossible odds. This is not enough, Valith said on the morning of the third day as she measured their collected water against the needs of 4 beings struggling to survive in the desert heat. Ours requires more hydration than the rest of us combined, and even with the stills, we are losing ground. Una nodded slowly because she had already calculated the same numbers and reached the same conclusion. And she stood at the edge of their small camp, looking toward the canyon system that cut through the landscape several kilometers to the north. I know, Una said. The stills are keeping us alive, but they will not save us unless we find a larger source. Ren looked up from his work on the communications array, which he had been trying to repair without success, and his compound eyes reflected fear and exhaustion in equal measure. There is no larger source, Ren said with despair heavy in his voice. The galactic surveys confirmed that Keth-4 has no subsurface water, and no hidden reservoirs, and nothing that could help us beyond what we are already collecting. Your surveys looked for water as you understand it, Una said without turning away from the distant canyons. Lakes and rivers and underground aquifers that machines can detect from orbit. She knelt and picked up a handful of the red desert soil, letting it run through her fingers as she studied its texture and composition with an intensity that Valith found unsettling. But my people learned long ago that water does not always announce itself, Una continued. Sometimes it hides in places so small and so subtle that only those who have learned to look with desperate eyes can find it. Valith approached the human and looked toward the same canyon system that had captured Una's attention, and she tried to see what the human was seeing, but the landscape revealed nothing to her trained and educated eyes. "What are you looking for?" Valith asked. Yuna pointed toward a cluster of small plants growing in the shadow of a rock formation near the canyon's edge. A patch of stubborn green in a world of endless red and brown and black. "Life gathers where water hides," Yuna said. "Always and without exception, because nothing can survive without moisture. And so wherever you find life, you can find the water that sustains it." She shifted her pointing finger toward a section of the canyon wall where the rock changed color slightly. A darker band running horizontally through the lighter stone around it. "Different minerals absorb water differently," Yuna explained. "That dark band may hold moisture that the surrounding rock does not. And where water collects in stone, there are often cracks and caves where it gathers over time." Valith considered this information and tried to reconcile it with the galactic surveys she had studied before selecting Kethfor for this training exercise. And she realized with growing unease that the surveys had never looked for water in such small and hidden forms. "Even if you are correct," Valith said slowly, "the distances are significant and the terrain is dangerous, and I cannot permit a student to risk death on a guess, no matter how educated that guess might be. Oris will die if I do not try," Yuna said with simple certainty. "And so will the rest of us eventually, because hope fades faster than water in a place like this." Before Valith could respond, Yuna had already begun walking toward the canyon system, her small human form growing smaller against the vast and indifferent landscape. Valith called after her, but the human did not stop and did not turn back. And the instructor found herself faced with a choice she had never expected to encounter. She could order Yuna to return and maintain the proper authority of a Galactic Academy instructor. Or she could trust in knowledge that no academy had ever taught and no database had ever recorded. "I am going with her," Valith said to Rin and Oris. "Stay here and continue collecting water, and do not lose hope, no matter how long we are gone." She followed the human across the burning sand and through the maze of rocks that led toward the canyon entrance. And as they walked, Yuna explained more about the techniques her ancestors had developed through thousands of years of desert survival. "Watch where insects emerge in the early morning," Yuna said as they entered the canyon, and the walls rose high around them, blocking out the worst of the sun's assault. "They need water too, and they know where to find it even when larger creatures cannot." She pointed toward tiny holes in the canyon floor where small creatures had burrowed into the cool ground below. And she explained how the presence of life in specific locations often indicated underground moisture that sustained entire hidden ecosystems. "Your surveys mapped this world from above," Yuna said. "But water on a desert world lives below, and you cannot understand what is hidden by studying only what is visible." They walked deeper into the canyon until they reached a section where the walls narrowed dramatically. And Yuna stopped before a crack in the stone that was barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. "The temperature drops here," Yuna said as she held her hand near the crack. "Cool air is flowing out, which means there is a space inside where the temperature stays lower than the surface." Valith felt the cooler air against her scales, and her hearts began to beat faster with something she barely recognized after so many years of teaching survival through textbooks and simulations, where cool underground air meets warm surface conditions. Yuna continued. Condensation can occur naturally and continuously without any technology at all. She began removing her outer clothing and equipment to make herself as slim as possible. And Valith watched with growing alarm as the human prepared to enter a crack in an alien world stone with no guarantee of what waited inside. "This is too dangerous," Valith said. "We do not know what is in there, and you could become trapped or injured or worse." Yuna looked at the instructor with calm certainty in her dark eyes. "My grandmother crawled through collapsed buildings to find water for her family during the war," Yuna said. "She told me that fear is a luxury that the thirsty cannot afford." Then she turned and squeezed into the crack and disappeared into the darkness beyond. And Valith could only stand and wait in hope that the human knowledge she had doubted for so long would prove true. Minutes passed that felt like hours, and the silence pressed against Valith's scales like a physical weight. And she began to fear that she had allowed a student to die because of her own failure to act. Then a sound emerged from the crack. The sound of movement and scraping and breathing. And Yuna's face appeared in the narrow opening with dust covering her features and something shining in her eyes. "Instructor," she said. "I found it." She held up a container, and even in the dim light of the canyon, Valith could see that it was full of water. More water than all their solar stills had produced in 2 days of desperate collection. "There is a cave inside," Yuna said as she pulled herself free from the crack. "The walls are wet with condensation, and there is a slow drip from the ceiling that has filled a natural basin over who knows how many years." Valith took the container with trembling hands and looked at the water that no galactic survey had ever detected. Water that existed only because a human had learned to see what technology could not measure. "How did you know?" Valith asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Yuna smiled with exhaustion and triumph mixing together on her dust-covered face. "I did not know," she admitted. "But my people learned long ago that sometimes you have to believe water exists before you can find it." She leaned against the canyon wall and caught her breath while Valith stared at the container of impossible water. And somewhere deep inside the instructor, something fundamental shifted and changed forever. Dawn came cold and pink across the desert of Kathfor, and Valith emerged from the shelter to find Yuna already kneeling beside the strange construction she had built the night before. The human had stretched a sheet of clear material across the shallow pit and weighted the edges with rocks. And in the center of the sheet she had placed a single small stone that created a downward point directly above a container sitting at the bottom of the hole. "Cadet Beak," Valith said with irritation sharpening her voice. "You should have been resting instead of wasting energy on whatever this is supposed to be." Yuna did not look up from her work as she made small adjustments to the positioning of the stones. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "This is not a waste, instructor," Yuna said. "This is how we survive." Rin emerged from the shelter with his compound eyes still clouded from sleep. And he clicked his mandibles in confusion as he studied the strange apparatus the human had created. "What is that thing?" he asked. "It looks like nothing more than a hole covered with debris from the crash, and I do not understand what purpose it could possibly serve." "It is called a solar still," Yuna said as she finally stood and brushed the red dust from her knees. "My species invented this technique thousands of years before we ever traveled to the stars." Valith felt her scales shift with skepticism because she had studied survival techniques from hundreds of worlds, and she had never encountered anything like what Yuna described. And she could not imagine how such a primitive arrangement could possibly help them in their current situation. "Explain," Valith demanded. "And explain quickly, because Oris needs water within the next day, or he will begin to die." Yuna pointed at the clear sheet stretched over the pit and began to speak in simple terms that even the panicking Rin could follow without difficulty. "The sun heats the ground inside the pit," Yuna said. "Any moisture in the soil or the air begins to evaporate and rise as the temperature increases throughout the morning." She traced her finger along the underside of the sheet without touching it and continued her explanation with the calm confidence of someone who had absolute faith in what she was describing. "The moisture rises until it hits the sheet, which is cooler than the air inside the pit. And when warm, wet air meets a cool surface, the water condenses into droplets, just like breath on a cold window." Rin leaned closer with sudden interest because he understood the physics of condensation, even if he had never considered applying it in this manner. and his compound eyes tracked every detail of the simple construction. The stone in the center creates a low point. Yuna continued. So the water droplets slide down the inside of the sheet and collect at the lowest spot where they drip into the container below. Impossible, Valeth said. The surveys of this world confirmed that there is no significant moisture in the soil and the humidity levels are far too low for condensation to occur. Yuna looked at the instructor with an expression that Valeth could not read. Something between pity and understanding, and the weight of knowledge earned through suffering that no survey could ever capture. The surveys measured what their instruments were designed to measure, Yuna said. But my ancestors did not have instruments, and they learned to find water in places where logic said no water could exist. She gestured toward the pit, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to warm the covered ground. And she spoke of Earth and the deserts her people had crossed and the techniques they had developed to survive in places of impossible thirst. Humans lived in deserts for thousands of years before we had any technology at all, Yuna said. We learned that water hides in everything if you know where to look, because plants hold moisture and soil holds moisture, and even the air itself carries water that the desperate and the patient can collect. Valeth wanted to argue, but something in the human's voice stopped her. A certainty born not from arrogance, but from generations of knowledge, passed down through families who had faced death and found ways to live anyway. We will see, Valeth said. But I will not raise false hopes among the others until you can prove that this primitive technique actually works. The morning passed slowly as the sun climbed higher and the temperature rose toward its brutal midday peak. And Valeth found herself returning again and again to check on the solar still despite her. Skepticism Morris grew weaker as the hours passed, and his skin began to show the first signs of dangerous dehydration. The cracks forming along his arms and the dullness spreading across his usually bright ice-rin paste, and clicked and muttered calculations under his breath, as if mathematics could somehow solve a problem that required water rather than equations. And his panic grew more visible with every passing hour. Only Yuna remained calm as she monitored her construction and made notes about the angle of the sun and the temperature differential between the covered pit and the surrounding desert air. Shortly after midday, she called out to the others, and her voice carried something that sounded almost like triumph. Come and see, she said. Valeth approached the solar still and looked down through the clear sheet. And what she saw there made her heart skip in a way she had not experienced since her earliest days as a survival instructor. Water droplets clung to the underside of the sheet like tiny jewels catching the light. And as she watched, a drop slid slowly down toward the center point and fell into the container below with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent desert. It is not much, Yuna admitted as she carefully lifted the sheet and retrieved the container. Maybe enough to wet the lips and nothing more from this single still. She carried the container to Oris and held it to his cracked lips and helped him drink the small amount of water she had pulled from the empty air and the dead ground of a world that everyone said held no water at all. But we can build more, Yuna said as she turned to face Valeth with something fierce burning in her dark eyes. We can cover this area with stills and collect enough water to keep us alive until rescue arrives. Valeth stared at the human and tried to understand what she was feeling, because her entire career had been built on galactic knowledge and galactic techniques and galactic surveys that mapped every world with perfect precision. Yet here stood a member of a species that had only joined the Union 3 years ago. A species that many considered primitive and dangerous and barely worthy of galactic citizenship. And she had just done something that no galactic database said was possible. My grandmother taught me this, Yuna said softly, as if reading the question in Valeth's expression. She survived a war on Earth with less than we have here, and she always said that water finds a way if you give it a path to follow. Rin approached the container and examined the small amount of water inside with wonder spreading across his features. And when he spoke, his voice had lost all trace of mockery. "How? Do we build more of these stills?" he asked Yuna. Smiled for the first time since the this time. Crash and began gathering materials from the wreckage while explaining the process step by step. And Valith watched the human work and felt something shift inside her chest. It felt like the first crack forming in a wall she had spent decades building. And she did not know yet whether that crack would destroy her or set her free. The shuttle hit the ground hard, and everything went wrong in an instant. Instructor Valith Sauron felt her body slam against the safety harness as metal screamed and twisted around her. And when the chaos finally stopped, she found herself hanging sideways in a cabin, filled with smoke and sparks and the smell of burning circuits. She had trained hundreds of students across 4 decades of service to the Galactic Academy, and she had never once lost a shuttle during a survival examination until today. "Status report," she called out, her blue scales flickering with stress patterns she could not control. "Everyone speak now." A clicking sound came from her left where Cadet Rin Torvax pulled himself free from a pile of debris, his insectoid body scratched but functional, and his compound eyes blinked rapidly as he tried to process what had just happened to them. "I'm alive," Rin said in a voice that trembled with barely controlled panic. "But instructor, I do not understand how this could happen because the shuttle was fully inspected before departure." From the back of the cabin came a wet, gasping sound that made Valith's heart clench with immediate concern. And she turned to see Cadet Oris Venthan struggling to breathe as his amphibian gills fluttered uselessly in the dry air. "Oris is injured," came a calm voice from somewhere near the emergency hatch. And Valith looked to see the human cadet Yuna Beak already moving toward her struggling classmate with a medical kit in her hands. Valith watched the human work with quiet efficiency as she checked Oris for broken bones and gave him a hydration patch from the emergency supplies. And something about the way Yuna moved bothered the instructor in a way. She could not quite name humans and only joined the Galactic Union 3 years ago. And Valith still did not trust them, despite what the politicians said about their potential value to Bawit. Galactic civilization. They came from a death world where everything tried to kill everything else. And their species had somehow survived by being more stubborn and more violent than all the other creatures on their terrible planet. The Galactic Academy had admitted humans as a political gesture, according to most instructors. And Valith had voted against their inclusion at every faculty meeting where the topic arose. Now she was stranded on a Class 7 desert world with one of them, and she could not help but wonder if the human would prove to be a liability or an asset in the days ahead. "We need to assess our situation," Valith said as she finally freed herself from the harness and stood on unsteady legs. Ren checked the communications array and Yuna continued treating Oris while I examine our supplies. The next hour brought nothing but bad news. Ren reported that the emergency beacon was damaged and would broadcast only a weak signal that might take days to reach any rescue station. And even then the rescuers would need time to locate them on this vast and empty world. Valith found that their water recycler had been completely destroyed in the crash, crushed beneath a support beam that had torn loose during impact. And the backup unit was missing entirely, which suggested it had been thrown from the shuttle during their violent descent. They had emergency water rations designed to sustain 4 beings for 2 standard days. And rescue would take at minimum 6 days if everything went perfectly, which it never did. "I must be honest with all of you," Valith said as she gathered her students around her in the shade of the wrecked shuttle. "Our situation is extremely dangerous, and I calculate our chances of survival at less than 12%. Rin made a high-pitched sound of distress that echoed across the barren landscape. And Oris closed his large, wet eyes as if accepting a death sentence. He had always known would come for him someday. Only Una remained silent, and, still with her dark eyes fixed on the horizon where heat waves danced above endless stretches of red sand and black rock. The Kalori require more water than other species. Valith continued in a voice she forced to remain steady. Ours will begin to suffer first as his skin dries and cracks, and the rest of us will follow within days after our rations run out. There must be something we can do, Rin said with desperation coating every word. We have technology and training, and surely the Galactic Academy prepared us for situations like this. Valith shook her head slowly because she had taught survival courses for 40 years, and she knew exactly what they faced on Keth 4. This world had been chosen for advanced training, precisely because it offered no easy solutions and no hidden resources that students could stumble upon by accident. And every galactic survey had confirmed that no water existed anywhere on its surface or beneath its stone. We will ration what we have and hope the beacon brings rescue before we perish, Valith said. That is all we can do. Una finally spoke for the first time since treating Oris, and her voice was soft but carried clearly in the still air of the desert afternoon. Instructor, she said, what direction does the wind blow at dawn on this world? Valith stared at the human with confusion because the question seemed completely irrelevant to their desperate situation. And she wondered if stress had already begun to affect the young cadet's mental stability. The wind patterns shift throughout the day based on temperature differentials. Valith answered after a moment of hesitation. At dawn, the wind typically moves from the canyon regions toward the open desert as cool air flows downward from higher elevations. And at night, Una continued with that same strange calm. Does the temperature drop significantly below the daytime readings? Yes, the differential is quite extreme, Valith said. Temperatures can swing by 40 degrees between midday and midnight, which makes shelter absolutely essential for survival. Una nodded slowly as if these answers confirmed something she had suspected. And then she turned and walked toward the wreckage without another word, leaving Valith and the other students to watch her with bewilderment. What is she doing? Rin asked as Una began pulling sheets of material from the ruined shovel and gathering rocks from the ground nearby. I do not know, Valith admitted. Perhaps humans process grief and fear differently than other species, and she needs to occupy herself with meaningless activity. But something in the way Una moved suggested purpose rather than panic. And Valith found herself unable to look away as the human cadet began digging a shallow pit in the ground near a cluster of dark stones. The sun moved across the sky and the shadows grew longer and still. Una worked without stopping for rest or water. And by the time darkness fell, she had created something that Valith did not recognize. Cadet Beak, Valith called out. You need to conserve your energy and join us in the shelter before the temperature drops. Una looked up from her work, and in the fading light her expression held something that Valith could not identify. Something between confidence and sorrow and ancient knowledge passed down through generations of her strange and violent species. I will join you soon, instructor, Una said. But first I need to finish this because tomorrow morning everything will change. Valith wanted to argue, but exhaustion pulled at her body, and the cold was already seeping into her scales. So she retreated to the shelter and left the human alone with her mysterious project and her impossible hope. That night Valith dreamed of water flowing through channels she could not see, and she woke before dawn with a feeling she had almost forgotten how to name it. Felt like the beginning of something she did not yet understand.